I'd like to start this video with a very simple experiment. I'm going to play you a recording of a single instrument with all of the mid frequencies removed. Now, as you're listening, I want you to consider two very simple questions. What instrument is being played and what notes are being played? Now, if you happen to have been listening on your mobile phone, it's possible that you didn't hear anything at all. But if you're listening on full range speakers, you were none the wiser, to be honest with you. It would have been very difficult for you to determine which instrument was being played and what notes were being played. So let's run the experiment again, but this time only listening to the middle frequencies and none of the very low or high frequencies. So if you were unsure last time, you're probably certain this time. You know that you were listening to a guitar, you probably determined that it was an acoustic guitar, and you were certainly aware of all the notes being played and a general impression of the feel of the music. And that's because the mid frequencies are not only important, but really crucial. They contain things often like the fundamentals of the notes or the sounds, plus the harmonic information as well. And very often it's the harmonic information which actually tells us humans like which instrument we're actually listening to. So now that we've established that the mid frequencies are really important, how do we use that information to improve our mixes? This video is sponsored by DistroKid. Follow the VIP link in the description down below to get 7% off an already amazing price to distribute your music to the world. Like many of you, I have a home studio to produce my music to the best of my ability. I don't actually have an ambition to be a mix engineer or a producer for other people, although I do it occasionally. So when I come across a technique which I feel kind of levels me up by a few steps really quickly, then I'm keen to tell you about it. And that's one of those times. We're going to be talking about focusing on the mid-range frequencies and what it can do for your mixes. And the good news is most of what we're going to discuss can be implemented completely free. These are things that you're going to be able to try out right away on your mixes, and I believe you're going to feel the benefit. So if it's all free, why have I got these Auratone 5C cube monitors on my desk? These monitors are often associated with focusing on mid-range frequencies. Well, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you later on that you don't actually need these. However, I've used them for the past few weeks and I do think there are some advantages that you should know about. But before we get into these, let's dive in and talk about the completely free techniques. So this is not rocket science, and you may already have guessed at what my approach will be here, but let's dive in anyway and take a look at the specifics. I happen to be in Studio One, but it doesn't matter what DAW you're using, the principle is going to be the same. And on my stereo or my master bus, I've already inserted an EQ plugin. Again, it doesn't matter which specific plugin you're using. I happen to be using FabFilter Pro Q3 today, but as long as your EQ plugin has the ability to use low and high cut filters or high and low pass filters, as they're sometimes referred to, then you're good to go. Now, if you look at 10 different people doing this, you'll probably find they're using 10 different settings. You don't have to be too precise about the settings here. You could start off by copying mine, but it really doesn't matter. Ballpark is absolutely fine. Although I do have a specific reason for choosing these settings, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But let's have a look at them first. So with the low cut filter, I've started it off at 290 Hertz here, and I'm using a slope of 18 decibels per octave. Now the default slope in FabFilter is 12, I think, but I wanted something a little bit steeper than this, so I selected 18. In terms of the high cut, it starts at 5000 Hertz or 5 kilohertz, and again it's got the same slope, 18 decibels per octave. Now the reason I've chosen these settings is because by ear it makes my full range speakers sound kind of similar to the Auratones, which I'm going to take a look at later. So this is a reasonable representation, although it's really not exactly the same, I've got to say, but roughly it sounds similar. Now, the actual frequency response, which we'll take a look at later, of those monitors goes from 80 hertz, I believe, up to 15,000 hertz or 15 kilohertz. So the reason why I've chosen these settings was because, say with the 290 here, yeah, we're setting it at 290 hertz, but the slope means that we can still hear things down at roughly 80 hertz, okay? It extends down maybe further than that, but it's not really audible. So I found with my ears that, you know, a signal at 80 hertz was still audible with this slope. And the same principle applied to the top end. So that's the reason why I've chosen these particular settings. But as I say, ballpark, please don't try and copy this exactly. Now, let's have a quick listen to my track sort of before and after. So before I've applied these cuts, let's have a listen. And I guess Superman never really ever gave a damn about. And then after. And I guess Superman never really ever gave a damn about. No. Now, a couple of words of warning. When you first switch to this, you're going to feel like you want to go back to the full range sound. It sounds so sort of lush in comparison. This sounds kind of boxy and lo-fi. So I'm just going to encourage you to be disciplined. Hang in there for a bit. In fact, I've heard some people say it's best not to switch directly from one to the other. Sort of set this up, go away and have a coffee, and then come back and start using this. If you don't hang in there with this, then you don't really get the benefits of it. In fact, when I first started doing this, I was sort of doing my basic mix with the full range monitors, and then I was switching to this to sort of check the mid frequencies, and I was switching briefly to it. But I found after a while that the better thing to do was better for me at least, was to start off my mix only using these frequencies, get the mix so I was as happy with it as I could be, and then when I really needed to hear that other low and high end information, then I started to use the full range when I needed to make decisions about it, I should say. Okay, so discipline is going to be key here, but I think it pays off. Now, the other thing that I would suggest with this, which is super important, is to make sure you use reference tracks. It's always important to use reference tracks anyway, because your ears are going to get fatigued and do weird things with you. So it helps to ground you again, a reference track. Now, just super briefly, whenever I mention reference tracks, I need to mention that you need to choose the right reference track. You need to choose something which is, you know, in a similar genre, perhaps with similar instruments being used, and that sounds like the kind of track that you're going for. You're not copying it, but it's roughly the kind of thing you're going for. Other thing to mention, make sure you set them to a similar volume to your track, which means normally you're going to have to turn them down a bit because they've been mastered and they sound a lot louder. So those are the two most important things when you're using this technique. Let me know in the comments down below after a couple of weeks maybe how you get along. Now, I just want to quickly show you an alternative to what I demonstrated there, and I stole this from my good buddy Chris Salim from Mixdown Online, who also made a great video on this topic. And basically with Chris's alternative approach here, instead of using an EQ plugin, you use a multi-band compressor. You set up your 3 bands, 1 low, 2 mid and 3 high. You can set the low and the high of the mid frequencies there to similar frequencies that we set with our EQ approach. And then you've got to make sure with all of these 3 bands that you've actually got the threshold, you know, set so that it's not compressing at all. So here with this isotope plugin, that means that we take the compressor threshold and just set it to 0 dB for all 3 bands. Okay, it's super important you do that. Now, the main advantage of this approach is that with many multi-band compressor plugins, you can easily solo any of these bands. So if you want to listen to those mid-range frequencies quickly, you can listen like so. And I guess Superman. And again, you would make use of reference tracks for this. But if you wanted to quickly, perhaps even reference the low end material, then you could just do that by soloing the low band here and listening to that. And the same with the high bands. Of course, you know, very similar approach. It just has that advantage of being able to solo the bands. So I want to take a moment to talk about something called mix translation. So the idea here is you want your mix to sound good on a wide range of devices. Everything from, say, a mobile phone speaker all the way up to a full hi-fi system. And of course, there are things in between with their own characteristics, like, say, TV speakers or earbuds that people are often listening on these days. Now, the problem here is they've all got different capabilities, especially in terms of frequency response. So it's a bit of a challenge to get your mix to sound good on all of them. Now, I have heard it said that this idea that people are now listening on earbuds so much has kind of made this mid-range idea, especially using specific equipment to listen to the mid-range, a little bit sort of old-fashioned, because not many people are listening, say, to AM radio anymore. However, a counter argument to this, which I have to say I found more convincing, is that when you take that full range of listening devices, all the way from the mobile phone up to the hi-fi system, the one thing that they all have in common is they have mid-range. If they didn't, then you'd get this kind of unintelligible sound like we heard at the beginning of the video. So because they all possess those mid-range frequencies, when you produce your mix and it sounds good in those frequency ranges, you've certainly done a lot of the work of translation. Now, it's not the full story. You still need to listen to those lows and those highs as well. But if you start off by focusing on the mids, then you get most of the work done. Now, I'm aware that I keep pointing to these Auratone monitors here, so I think it's about time we talked about them. Okay, so the history buffs can correct me in the comments down below if I'm wrong about this, but I do believe the original Auratones were designed in the 1950s, although they really gained popularity during the 70s and 80s. And you only have to Google these for a moment to find them associated with productions like Michael Jackson's Thriller and things like Fleetwood Mac's Rumours. Now, that's not to say if you buy these, you're going to produce the next Thriller album. There's a little bit more to it than that. But we can see from this that they're incredibly popular with some top-end producers. Why would that be? Well, for the reasons we've talked about. They're great at focusing on probably the most important part of the mix. Now, their design, this little sort of 6.5-inch cube, is pretty interesting because you can see that one of the main features of it is this 4.5-inch driver at the front. This really restricts the frequency response of this speaker. Now, with this particular model, and this is a modern iteration, they're actually powered. The original ones were passive and you had to source your own amplifier for them. Now, you can still get passive versions on their website and you can also get separate amplifiers there as well. But I really like this idea where it's all sort of integrated into one box. I don't have to worry about a separate amplifier. So it means they're pretty simple to use. When you look on the back, there's just a power switch, there's a connection for a power brick, and then there's just this connection for either a 1/4-inch jack or an XLR going from your audio interface or whatever switching device you're using. So simple to set up, simple to use. The main question you're probably asking yourself now is if I can set up that EQ curve that we looked at earlier to restrict the frequency response, why do I need some specialized monitors like this? Well, let's talk about some other advantages they have apart from that frequency response. So when you do finally get this mix sounding good, you want to release it to the world as quickly, as easily, and as economically friendly as possible. That's why I'd recommend you check out our sponsor, DistroKid. If you follow the VIP link in the description down below, you'll get 7% off of your first year of membership. One of the interesting physical characteristics of these monitors is the fact that they're completely sealed. There's no ports to the front or the back. Now, without going into the physics of this, the long and the short of it is, when you have a sealed unit like this, you have a faster transient response. This is helpful when you're doing critical listening for the timing aspects of your mix. So things like attack and release time on compression. And for me, and I've heard other people say this, they can make it easier to judge, say, the tail of reverbs. So that's something which can't be achieved by simply applying an EQ curve like we did earlier, and is completely because of the physical characteristics of these monitors. One of the other advantages of these monitors is the fact that they only have a single speaker or driver in them. And this is really great for something called phase coherence. What does that mean? Well, normally when you're listening on full range monitors like the ones behind me here, you'll have either 2 or 3 drivers or speakers, and each of those is responsible for a specific range of frequencies. But they do share some frequencies. Those are called crossover frequencies, and they can be problematic for various reasons, including, for example, the fact that the same frequencies may be reaching your ears at slightly different times as they come from different drivers. And this can cause something called phase cancellation. Now, I don't have time in this video to fully explain phase cancellation, so the long and the short of it is, with those specific frequencies, you can find them very difficult to judge. They can sound woolly or greatly sort of diminished, and that will affect your decisions about those frequencies. Now, manufacturers do take measures in various different ways to improve the timing of those frequencies from the various drivers. However, when you only have a single driver, you don't have to solve that problem. So you're not going to get the same phase cancellation issues that you will have with multiple drivers. So this is a great advantage as you're focusing with those really important mid-range frequencies. You're going to be confident that they're also not being affected by phase cancellation from the speakers themselves. Now, you can get phase cancellation from the room you're in. That's a whole different subject. Okay, so you may have noticed that I've been avoiding getting too sciencey with this. That's not the way I normally roll anyway. And now I'm going to go full-blown non-sciencey on this and talk about just my experience of using these as opposed to the EQ curve. And I want to say that if you cannot afford these for whatever reason, or don't want to afford them, you know, just use the EQ curve, that's fine. But I found that there's a kind of a psychological shift when you physically switch to something like these monitors as opposed to just using a plug-in in your DAW. Maybe it's the fact that you've kind of bought them as well and now you're really committed to this style of mixing. But definitely I found that there was just a different experience in listening to these for, you know, half an hour or what have you, as opposed to just sort of flicking a plug-in on. As well as that, you're not seeing anything visually. You know, you're always kind of aware of that EQ curve and what you're seeing. You're not seeing that with these. It's all about your ears. So look, take from that what you will. I know it does sound a little bit woolly, but that's my opinion. So I hope that your takeaway from this video would be that the mid-range is really important, and you today can start employing this kind of technique right away. And let me know in the comments down below if you find that you get better results from it. I will say, do be a little bit persistent with it. It may feel quite uncomfortable at first when you've gone from those lovely full range monitors down to just the mid range, but persevere with it. I really think it can make a difference. Now, if you're just starting out, I would not suggest that you buy these as your only studio monitors. That would be silly. You really do need to still hear the low and the high frequency ranges. However, once you're established and you've got your studio monitors, I think it can be a big advantage to get something like this as a second pair to help you to focus on those frequencies and for all of the other reasons I gave as well. And the good news about that is, in terms of how much we normally spend on studio monitors, these are not all that expensive. I think they're around about $750 for a pair. Okay, so not a big purchase, but you could get a big advantage. And by the way, it's quite legitimate just to buy one of these, both to listen to the mid-range and also to listen to your mix in mono as well. So you might want to start off by just trying one of these out. Anyway, there's a link for all that in the description down below. I'd love to hear your comments on it. Thank you so much for joining me today. Let me know how you get on. I'm Mike. I hope you're well, and I'll see you in the next video.